Welcome back to Visceral, and on this episode we take a look at Paul McCartney's 2.
Everybody bogey, I dig that bogey beat.
Chances are you know who Paul McCartney is. Obviously, this is one of the most famous musicians in the entire world, and we have to get a little backstory on Paul McCartney's 2 before we kind of get into the record, because I think that helps explain why this is such an interesting piece and why it's an odd recording from someone who's rather quite famous. So if we think back to the Let It Be sessions for the Beatles, obviously a very famous recording session that produced their very final record, but as we've seen through documentary footage and all the interviews that have come after it, it was kind of the end of the Beatles, that they were just wearing tired of dealing with each other and their various personalities, and they all wanted to go off and do something else, which makes it just a really interesting time in all of their careers. We saw that John Lennon went off with Yoko Ono, made some pretty remarkable records. Paul McCartney at first had gone out and made McCartney 1, and this record was one he was recording while the Let It Be sessions were happening, and he was trying to keep it under wraps because he knew that would create more friction with the band. That first record, McCartney 1, was somewhat well received. I think some people complained about the instrumentals in it, but it did have a couple tracks which we would say, this is quintessential Paul McCartney. I mean, this is the kind of pop songs that he would create in the Beatles. And from there, he would go on to make some other things, and he would eventually create a band called Wings with his wife, Linda McCartney. And after their record Back to the Egg, he began work on McCartney 2. And McCartney 2 was interesting because it was going to be a home recording. It was going to be one that is going to be using, at that time, a lot of brand new technology. In an interview that Paul McCartney had with Quietus, he said, "I really was just fascinated with these things called synthesizers, which had appeared on the scene. Particularly with sequencers, I loved them. It was new technology, and I just wanted to see what it was all about and have a go and see what I could do with it. Because the nice thing for me is you do an album like that and it forms other stuff. It keeps your brain fresh so that when you go and do something else, a tour or something, you may or may not be playing that stuff, but you've got the feeling or being someone who's not finished yet. I'm still experimenting, I think that's a pretty noble thing to say. I know musicians probably always say, I'm always growing, I'm always trying new things. But the truth is, many bands will be very comfortable in just kind of remaking the same thing that their fans liked before. And when you listen to McCartney 2, it can be a little shocking. I imagine when this record first came out, it was not one that a lot of people who generally would pick up a Beatles record really would enjoy. Maybe the very first song or one of the later singles called Waterfalls, but the very first song on this record is called Coming Up. And this is, I think, as close as you can get, other than Waterfalls, to being a Paul McCartney track. But even then, it doesn't quite sound like the things that you would associate with him with from the Beatles. It's my favorite song on the record. It's a really lovely jam. Second song is one that I imagine the minute it came on, most people said, this record is not for me. And that was Temporary Secretary, which you could see Paul McCartney really getting some influence from krautrock and some other kind of electronic music from that time period.
Can you find for me someone strong and sweet fitting on my knee? She can keep her job if she gets it wrong. Ah, but Mr. Marks, I won't need her long. All I need is help for a little while. We can take dictation and learn to...
Definitely not the easiest track to take in if you're not a little in tune with that kind of experimental music, but it's become kind of a cult classic since then. As I mentioned before, the track Waterfalls became a hit single, at least in Britain. It didn't do so well here, which is true for most of this record. Record World described it as arguably the least well-received solo work of any Beatle. which is pretty harsh. And I think, thankfully, it's gained some more positive attention in recent years as people have looked back on it and seen, oh, Paul McCartney was trying some interesting things here, that he really was trying to push himself out of that box that, unfortunately, I think he's often been pegged into. In the Beatles, the dichotomy was that John Lennon, this is the dark, brooding, serious, experimental musician, and Paul McCartney, he's the sunny, poppy side. And while that is somewhat true if we look at their work, I think Paul McCartney has actually done a lot more in the way of experimentation in his career than he's often given credit for. This is just one of those examples. Kind of interesting tidbit as well is that this record really came about after he was about to have a tour with his band Wings in Japan. Paul McCartney, being a man of the 60s, had some arrests for having marijuana, and that kept him out of being able to travel to Japan. Until 1980 rolls around, they have this massive sold-out tour of the country. They arrive, and at customs, they find marijuana in Paul McCartney's bag. Obviously, the tour then is canceled, has some other problems. And that kind of has him realize, you know what, maybe I'm just going to double down on this record, these recordings that I've been making along the way. Thankfully, this record has been re-released recently, and in addition to having some live tracks, which are pretty interesting, and just having it reissued on a really nice format if you want to get it on vinyl, if the copies you're finding in record stores are a bit scratched up. It also includes Check My Machine, which I believe was one of the earlier tracks that he had recorded using this new recording equipment and synthesizers and sequencers. It's a really great track. I really love that one. The record, like I said before, gained some more positive attention. In 2003, Mojo placed the album at number 26 on their list of top 50 eccentric albums. And then in 2011, NME included the album on their list of 100 albums to hear before you die. So while this might not be the kind of record a lot of Beatle fans were hoping for, definitely not one a lot of McCartney fans wanted when it was released, it's still a really great addition to the larger Beatles catalog or their extensive solo work, and it's something I would definitely recommend checking out. That's all for today, folks. So tell us what you think of Paul McCartney's 2 down below, and make sure you click subscribe. We hope to get at least one video up every single week, and we'll talk to you more about the upcoming podcasts in a couple.